Welcome, dear listener. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Maybe you're curled up on the couch after a long day of editing. Maybe you're lying in bed with your dog resting at your feet. Or maybe you're simply looking for a gentle story to fall asleep to. Whatever the reason, thank you for keeping me company. Now, before we begin, a little confession. I once tried to organize my own Library of Alexandria on a bookshelf in my apartment. I lasted about 10 minutes before my dog knocked over a stack of notebooks. My coffee spilled on a draft of this very script. I realized, thankfully, that I'm not Ptolemy. Just someone who keeps losing bookmarks and accidentally dog-ears pages. I swear I won't. And honestly, I like to think the ancient scribes did the same. Maybe a scroll rolled off a table. Maybe someone borrowed a play by Sophocles and just never gave it back. Some things really never change. Even the greatest libraries were probably full of slightly chaotic, very human moments. History, after all, isn't always loud. Doesn't always arrive with trumpets or thunder. Sometimes it speaks in the rustle of a papyrus scroll, in the soft scratch of a reed pen on dried reeds, in the quiet footsteps of a scholar walking through marble halls just before dawn. And if anyone tells you that knowledge is permanent, remind them of the Library of Alexandria where the greatest collection of human thought once lived, and then vanished, like mist, under morning sun. There's a gentle irony in it, isn't there? We spend lifetimes writing, copying, preserving only for time to fold those efforts into silence. But maybe that's not tragedy. Maybe it's just part of the rhythm, like tides. It's like breath. So, dear listener, take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop, unclench your jaw, close your eyes if you'd like, or let them rest gently on the screen. Tonight, we'll take a journey through history slow, quiet and unhurried, like turning the fragile pages of an old book. Over the next 2 hours, we'll wander through 10 chapters, each one a window into another moment. We won't rush, won't dramatize. We'll simply linger on the scent of cedar shelves, on the weight of a scroll in trembling hands, on the silence that followed when the last lamp went out in a place that once held all the world's knowledge. We'll begin before the library even existed, when wisdom was scattered like seeds on the wind. Then we'll walk with the Ptolemies as they dreamed of gathering every book ever written under one roof. We'll meet the scribes who copied texts by candlelight, the scholars who debated under colonnades, and the last philosopher who walked those halls before the world turned away. And in the end, we'll ask not who burned it, but what do we do now with the fragments we still have? If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been with me for a while, thank you for coming back. These stories are made to be shared, not hoarded. So if this quiet space means something to you, if it's helped you rest, think, or just breathe for a moment, I'd be truly honored if you'd consider subscribing. Not for flashy reasons, but so you never miss a night like this again. No pressure, no noise, just a gentle reminder that you're always welcome here. Ready? Let's step into the light of ancient Alexandria. Together. Imagine the early morning light spreading across quiet riverbanks not as a sudden burst, but as a slow unveiling, like a hand gently lifting a veil of mist. The air is cool and still, carrying the scent of wet reeds and damp earth. A scribe sits cross-legged on a woven mat, his back slightly curved from years of work, his fingers calloused but precise. He dips his reed into a small clay pot of ink made from soot and gum arabic, then presses it onto a sheet of papyrus laid flat on a low wooden table. Papyrus is still warm from the sun that dried it days before, its surface slightly rough, fibrous, alive. There are no libraries yet, no grand halls, no catalog shelves, only this, hands that copy, voices that recite, and memories that carry what the world has said. Generation after generation, like a secret passed from one heart to another. Knowledge lives not in one place, but in many, scattered like seeds across continents. Carried in the folds of memory, the curves of pottery, the carvings of stone, in the dim chambers of Egyptian temples, deep within labyrinthine corridors, lit only by flickering oil lamps. Priests whisper hymns older than the pyramids themselves. Their words are not meant for public ears. They are sacred utterances, spells to guide the dead, praises to keep the sun rising. These words are carved into basalt walls, painted in ochre and lapis on coffins, tucked into tombs wrapped in linen beside mummified hands. To read them is not merely to learn it, is to trespass on sacred ground, to step into a conversation between mortals and gods that was never meant for outsiders. Knowledge here is not shared. It is guarded, layered in symbolism, accessible only to those who have spent lifetimes learning how to listen. In Babylon, far to the east, astronomers sit on flat rooftops after dusk, their eyes fixed on the slow, silent dance of stars across the velvet sky. The city below hums with the murmur of evening life vendors closing stalls, children being called home, but up here, time seems to pause. They press wedge-shaped marks into damp clay tablets with styluses of bone, their movements deliberate, almost reverent. These tablets are small enough to hold in one hand, heavy with the weight of the earth they came from, cool to the touch, even in summer heat. They record not just constellations, but omens, the path of Venus, the color of Mars, the moment Jupiter rises. For them, the sky is not just beauty, it's prophecy. A shift in the heavens might mean drought, war, or the death of a king, and so their work is not abstract. It is urgent, woven into the fabric of daily survival, of royal decisions, of harvests yet to come. Far to the east, beyond deserts and mountains, in the green forests of India, students sit cross-legged in open courtyards beneath banyan trees, whose roots twist like ancient serpents into the earth. They do not write. Not yet. Instead, they listen and repeat. A teacher chants a line from the Rig Veda, his voice low and rhythmic, and the students echo it back, syllable by syllable until the words settle into their bones, into the very rhythm of their breath. This is not rote memorization. It is embodiment. A poem is not a thing to be stored on a shelf, but a living presence that moves through the body when spoken. Why would they trust fragile papyrus when the human voice, when trained with discipline and devotion, can carry a text for centuries without error? And more than that, a poem spoken with breath, with intonation, with the warmth of a human throat, carries a soul that ink on a silent scroll can never replicate. In Greece, beneath the silver-green leaves of olive trees that have watched generations come and go, men walk in slow, meditative circles, their sandals brushing against dry grass and scattered stones. They speak of justice, of virtue, of whether the stars are divine or merely fire. Their debates are not recorded in ledgers or decrees. They leave no paper trail, only ripples in the minds of those who listen. A clever phrase, "man is the measure of all things," might be carried by a merchant on a ship to Sicily, repeated in a tavern in Syracuse, then whispered decades later in an Egyptian port by a traveler who heard it secondhand. Ideas drift like pollen on the wind. Some land on fertile ground and bloom. Others vanish into the sea, never to be heard again. But in that drifting, there is a kind of beauty, a world, where thought is fluid, unwound, free. Books, if we can even call them that, are fragile, fleeting things. Papyrus, made from the pith of river reeds, cracks in the dry heat of summer, its fibers splitting like old skin, mixed from lamp-black and water, fades in sunlight until the words become ghosts on the page. Scrolls, if not tied carefully with linen thread, unravel in the breeze, spilling their contents onto dusty floors. Most never leave the city where they are written. A medical text stays in a healer's home, a love poem in a lover's chest, a treaty in a governor's archive. They are read by a handful, sometimes only one, then stored away in cedar boxes, under beds, in temple corners, or simply forgotten when the reader dies and no one else knows how to read the script or why it mattered. And yet people keep writing. Not for fame, few scribes ever signed their names. Not for power, most texts were never meant for rulers. But because something inside them insists. This matters. Someone should know this. A dyer in Tyre copies a recipe for purple dye, not to sell it, but to ensure his son can continue the craft. A Phoenician sailor sketches a coastline he's never seen before based on rumors from other ships, hoping it might guide someone home. A grieving mother in Thebes writes her child's name on a shard of broken pottery, a ostracanand, buries it in the sand near the riverbank, as if the earth itself might remember what she cannot bear to forget. These are not grand acts of history. They are quiet rebellions against oblivion. There is no system, no central archive, no universal language, not yet. Knowledge drifts like pollen on a warm breeze, invisible, weightless, carried by forces beyond human control. It clings to the hem of a merchant's robe as he walks from Susa to Tyre. It hides in the folds of a sailor's log, tucked beneath a sleeping mat on a Phoenician galley. It rides on the tongue of a wandering bard who sings of gods and floods in a dozen dialects, adapting his tale to the ears of each new village. A Babylonian star chart, etched into damp clay with meticulous care, might survive a shipwreck only to wash ashore near Corinth, where a curious boy finds it half buried in sand and carries it to a local elder who once studied the sky. An Egyptian remedy for fever written in hieratic script on a scrap of papyrus might be traded not for coin, but for a jar of olive oil in a Carthaginian market. Its instructions painstakingly translated by a healer who mixes myrrh with honey and whispers a prayer as she administers it. Sometimes two fragments meet by pure accident. A Greek philosopher, exiled from Athens, stumbles upon a Persian manuscript in a trading post near the Euphrates and spends weeks puzzling over its strange script, only to discover a vision of ethics based not on reason alone but on cosmic balance and inner fire. Or an Indian mathematician in Taxila hears, through a Silk Road merchant with frostbitten fingers and stories of distant seas, of a man named Euclid who proved truths not with observation, but with pure thought, and that idea, fragile as a moth's wing, takes root in his mind and reshapes how he sees numbers forever. In those rare, quiet collisions, the world feels less like a patchwork of warring tribes and more like a single, breathing mind scattered across deserts and mountains and seas, yes, but connected by invisible threads of curiosity, wonder, and the unspoken belief that someone, somewhere, might understand. What's striking isn't how much was lost, but how much survived it all. Think of it, against fire that consumes entire cities in a night, against floods that swallow riverbanks and wash away temples, against wars that erase names and burn libraries for sport, against the slow, patient decay of time that turns ink to dust and papyrus to air still, something remains. And it survives not because of kings or empires, but because of ordinary hands. The scribe who stays up past midnight to copy one more page before the scroll crumbles in his fingers. The teacher who wakes before dawn to recite a poem to a single student, knowing that if he doesn't, no one else will remember it. The mother who scratches her child's name onto a broken piece of pottery and buries it beneath a fig tree, not as a record for history, but as a private act of love that says, "You were here, you mattered." The sailor who risks his life to save a chest of scrolls during a storm, not because they're valuable, but because they feel sacred. These acts leave no monuments. No statues are raised in their honor. No chronicles list their names. But without them, without this quiet, relentless chain of care stretching across generations, every word, every idea, every dream would have vanished into silence. They are the unseen roots beneath the tree of knowledge, feeding it not with glory, but with devotion. And in that scattered world, where knowledge floats like dust motes in a sunbeam, a new thought begins to form, not loud, not sudden, but steady, like the first drop of rain before a storm that has been gathering for centuries. It starts as a whisper in the mind of a traveler who has seen too many brilliant ideas lost to neglect. It grows in the heart of a scholar who weeps over a half-burned scroll, wishing there had been a second copy. It takes shape in the quiet frustration of a translator who knows that somewhere, in another land, someone wrote the missing piece to the puzzle he's been trying to solve for years. What if all this could be gathered? Not locked away, not claimed by one nation or priesthood, but brought together under one roof in one city, in one shared space where it could be copied, compared, questioned, and passed on. What if instead of knowledge drifting like ash on the wind here today, gone tomorrow, it could rest safe and tended, like seeds in a granary? Not just for priests who guard secrets or kings who hoard power, but for anyone with a question in their heart and patience in their hands. The curious apprentice, the grieving poet, the foreign student who speaks with an accent but thinks with clarity. It would be a place not of answers, but of better questions. It's a sanctuary not for the powerful, but for the thoughtful. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? To collect every book ever written, to hold the whole of human thought in one place? To imagine that the songs of India, the star charts of Babylon, the laws of Rome, the hymns of Egypt, the dialogues of Greece, the remedies of Persia could coexist in harmony, not as rivals, but as voices in a single, vast conversation. And yet, someone, somewhere, begins to believe it's possible. Not as a fantasy spun in idle hours, but as a duty whispered by the ghosts of lost texts. As an act of love not romantic, but profound for what humans have dared to think in the face of chaos. To feel in the midst of suffering, to imagine beyond the horizon, to mourn with honesty, to hope against evidence. This belief doesn't stay abstract. It takes root in the mind of a man who has seen empires rise and fall and wonders if there's a quieter way to leave a mark on the world. It grows in the soil of a new city, built not on ancient ruins, but on open sand beside a sea that connects continents. It seeks stone for its walls, cedar for its shelves, ink for its copies, and light both from the sun and from the mind to keep it alive. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting golden ripples across the harbor of Alexandria city, barely a generation old, yet already humming with the languages of 100 lands, a new kind of monument begins to rise, not of gold plundered from temples, not of weapons forged for conquest, but of words, copied, translated, preserved. And at its heart will stand a king who inherited an empire through war, yet chooses to build his legacy, not with armies but with archives. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, once a general under Alexander, now a ruler who understands that the truest power lies not in how much you can destroy, but in how much you can save. Dreamer of a quieter kind of empire, one built not on fear, but on understanding. Let's meet him now. Imagine the city of Alexandria in its earliest days, not yet the legendary jewel of the Mediterranean, but a bold experiment drawn in sand, sea, and ambition. The air is thick with the scent of salt spray and wet limestone, mingling with the sharp, resinous aroma of freshly cut cedar beams being hoisted into place by teams of laborers whose songs rise and fall with the rhythm of the ropes. Gulls cry overhead, their wings flashing white against a sky so blue it seems polished. Ships from a dozen lands roads with its marble, Athens with its olive oil, Memphis with its papyrus stock at a harbor still being shaped by engineers who measure tides with sticks and prayers. And in the heart of this new city, where desert meets water and east meets west, a king walks alone through an empty courtyard, his sandals whispering against marble slabs not yet worn by time or footfall. He is not thinking of armies or tribute or the weight of a crown. He is thinking of books, of how they gather dust when left alone, how they fade when unread, how they die when forgotten, and wondering if there might be a way to give them a home where they could live, breathe, and speak to anyone who cared to listen. Ptolemy, the first Sotor, was once a general under Alexander the Great, a man who had marched across continents, seen cities burn, and watched empires rise and crumble in the span of a single campaign season. He knew the weight of a sword, the taste of battlefield dust, the silence that follows a massacre. But when Alexander died young, and his vast empire shattered like glass dropped on stone, Ptolemy made a quiet, deliberate choice. He took Egypt not for its gold alone, though it was rich, nor for its grain, though it fed the Mediterranean, but for its memory. He saw something others missed in the chaos of succession. The true power might not lie in how many cities you conquer, but in how many minds you nourish. So instead of building only fortresses and barracks, he builds a sanctuary not to war, but to the muses, the Mausian, a home for poets who weave grief into verse, astronomers who map the slow dance of stars, physicians who seek cures in roots and resins, and philosophers who ask questions that have no easy answers. These scholars are given rooms with sea views, meals of bread, olives, cheese, and wine, and salaries paid in silver, not as servants of the state, but as free thinkers, protected from the noise of politics and the demands of commerce. It is radical, unprecedented. A quiet revolution dressed not in armor, but in linen and sandals. It's unfolding not in the streets with torches and shouts, but in sunlit courtyards where olive trees cast long, dappled shadows, and the only sound is the soft scratch of a reed pen on papyrus, steady as a heartbeat. Beside the Mausian, he lays the foundation for something even bolder, something almost unimaginable in its generosity. A place to gather every book ever written, every scroll, every tablet, every hymn, every map, every recipe, every poem, no matter where it came from or who wrote it. Not just the epics of Homer or the tragedies of Sophocles, but the secret hymns of Egyptian priests chanted in temples older than memory. The meticulous star charts of Babylonian skywatchers pressed into damp clay. The medical texts of Persian healers describing herbs from mountains no Greek has ever seen. Even the strange mathematical treatises from India that speak of nothing as a number with its own place in the cosmic order. The vision is staggering not in its scale, but in its humility. If knowledge exists anywhere in the world, it belongs here not to be hoarded like treasure, not to be locked away for the elite, but to be shared, compared, questioned, and passed on. This is not a library as a vault of secrets. It is a library as a conversation across centuries and continents, a table where all voices Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Indian, Hebrew are invited to sit, not as rivals, but as guests in a shared house of thought. The building itself is not grand in the way of palaces or temples. There are no golden gates, no towering statues of gods with thunderbolts or scales of justice. Instead, it is designed for calm, for function, for the quiet work of preservation. Long halls stretch like arms, lined with shelves of fragrant cedar, chosen not for beauty alone, but because its oils repel insects and its scent, warm and woody, soothes the mind during long hours of reading. Reading rooms are oriented to catch the morning light, their windows draped with linen curtains dyed pale yellow to soften the glare and cast a golden glow over the scrolls. Courtyards are shaded by fig and pomegranate trees, their branches heavy with fruit in season, their leaves rustling like whispered secrets in the breeze. The floors are polished limestone, cool underfoot even in the height of summer, and the air carries a layered perfume, the dry, papery sweetness of aged papyrus. The faint metallic temps of ink made from soot and gum arabic, the earthy smell of beeswax used to seal fragile edges, and beneath it all, the quiet hum of concentration, a sound like bees in a hive, but softer, more patient, more human. Every ship that enters the great harbor is searched not for weapons, not for contraband, not for spies, but for books. This is not an act of censorship, but of collection. If a scroll is found in a merchant's chest, in a diplomat's satchel, or even tucked beneath a sailor's sleeping mat, it is taken to the library, where teams of scribesmen and women trained in multiple scripts and dialects copy it with meticulous, almost devotional care. They sharpen their reeds to the perfect point, mix their ink to the right consistency, and unroll the original with hands that have learned to handle fragile papyrus without tearing it. The copy is made to be as faithful as possible, not just in words, but in spacing, in marginal notes. Even in the slight smudges that give a text its human character, the original is kept in the library's inner chambers. The copy is returned to its owner, often so indistinguishable from the original that the difference is nearly invisible. Some say Ptolemy's agents even confiscated originals and gave back good enough copies, a rumor that may or may not be true, but which reveals a deeper truth. Here, words are more valuable than cargo, more precious than spices or silk, more enduring than gold. Among the first to shape this dream into reality is Zenodotus of Ephesus, the library's first head librarian. He does not wear robes of office or carry a staff of authority. He dresses like any scholar's simple wool tunic, leather sandals worn thin, a satchel slung over his shoulder holding scrolls he's still puzzling over. But in his hands, he holds something revolutionary, the first catalog of human knowledge, which he calls the Pinax, sorts texts not just by subject medicine, astronomy, poetry, but by author, by dialect, by region of origin. He compares dozens of versions of Homer's Iliad, noting which lines appear in which copies, which words differ, which passages are missing. He invents punctuation dots placed at different heights, spaces between sentences, not for decoration, but to make reading easier for those who speak Greek as a second language, for students from distant lands who come here seeking understanding. He is not a ruler, not a gatekeeper, but a gardener, tending the roots of thought so they can grow straight, so that future readers won't stumble in the dark. The library grows not with fanfare, not with royal proclamations, but with quiet accumulation, a slow, steady gathering of fragments. Visiting philosopher from Syracuse, grateful for the hospitality and the chance to consult rare texts, leaves behind his notes on geometry, tied with a faded blue ribbon. A royal decree orders that all treaties signed in Egypt, all laws passed by the council, All astronomical observations made by the court's skywatchers be sent here for safekeeping, not as propaganda, but as records of human effort. A grieving widow donates her husband's collection of love poems, each one annotated in his careful hand, some with pressed flowers still tucked between the lines. Scrolls arrive wrapped in linen, sealed in wax stamped with foreign sigils, carried in chests lined with cedar shavings to keep away moths. Each one is unrolled with care, examined for damage cracks, stains, insect nibbles catalogued with notes on its origin and condition, and placed on a shelf where it can be found again, not lost in chaos, but held in order. The collection becomes a living organism breathing, growing, remembering, fed not by conquest, but by generosity. And yet, no one at the time calls it the greatest library in the world. That phrase comes centuries later. From poets and historians who never saw its halls, who imagine it as a mythic palace of infinite knowledge. At this moment, in this city, it is simply a place where curiosity is welcome, where a question is never too small, too strange, or too foreign, where a student from Carthage can sit beside a local scholar from Alexandria and read the same medical text, each in their own tongue, and still understand the same truth about the human body. It is imperfect. Women rarely walk its halls as equals, their voices often filtered through male translators. Egyptian knowledge is sometimes treated as exotic rather than equal. Local traditions are occasionally bent to fit Greek frameworks, but within the limits of its time. It tries, genuinely and persistently, to hold the world's mind in one room, not as a museum of trophies, but as a workshop of shared understanding. It is not built for eternity, but for now, for the student who needs a map to navigate the Nile, for the physician who seeks a cure for a child's fever, for the poet who wants to hear how others have sung of loss, for the astronomer who wonders if the stars move in circles or ellipses. The library does not promise answers. It only promises access to the past, to other minds, to the long, slow, often messy conversation of being human. It is a place where knowledge is not owned, but borrowed, where every reader is a temporary guardian, and every copied scroll is an act of hope that someone, someday, will care enough to read it. And as the sun sets over the Pharos lighthouse, its beacon not yet lit, but soon to guide ships from every known shore, the last golden light spills across the marble floors of the library, catching motes of dust that swirl like tiny galaxies in the air. In the copying rooms, the lamps are lit one by one, small clay bowls filled with olive oil, their wicks trimmed to burn clean and steady. The scribes settle at their low tables, their backs straight, their hands calm. They sharpen their reeds, test their ink, and unroll the night's first scroll. In that soft, flickering glow, a new kind of legacy takes root, not of conquest, not of empire, but of care. Not of noise, but of quiet turning pages, of ink meeting papyrus, of one mind reaching across time to touch another. But who were the hands that turned those pages every day? Who lived among the scrolls, breathed their dust, mended their tears, and guarded their silence, not for glory, not for history, but for love of the words themselves, for the quiet joy of knowing that somewhere, someone might one day read what they had saved. Let us meet them now, the unseen keepers of the world's memory. Imagine the quiet rhythm of a morning in the library, the silence of emptiness, but the deep, breathing stillness of a place where thought is honored. The first light of dawn slips through high windows, casting long golden beams that cut through the cool air like gentle fingers, illuminating motes of dust that swirl in slow hypnotic spirals. Somewhere a cedar shelf creaks softly under the weight of centuries of words. A pair of sandals whispers against polished limestone as a librarian walks barefoot through the main hall, his steps careful, reverent, as if afraid to disturb the sleep of the scrolls resting on their shelves. Outside, the city of Alexandria is already stirring, fishermen hauling nets, merchants unloading crates, children running through alleyways. But here, time moves differently. Here the world is measured not in hours, but in breaths, in the slow unrolling of papyrus, in the patient stroke of a reed pen across a blank page. This is not a place of spectacle or ceremony. It is a sanctuary of small hands and steady hearts, where the most important work happens in silence, unseen, uncelebrated, and yet utterly essential. The keepers are not the kind of people history remembers. You will not find their names etched into marble or recited in royal courts. They are scribes with ink-stained fingers, translators who speak 3 languages but own only 1 tunic, catalogers who spend their days comparing versions of Homer line by line, and young apprentices who sweep the floors with brooms made of bundled reeds, careful not to let dust settle on the open scrolls. They rise before the sun, wash their hands in basins of water drawn from the well at dawn, and tie back their hair with simple cords of linen or wool to keep it from brushing against wet ink. Their workspaces are modest, low wooden tables worn smooth by decades of use, stools carved from olive wood, and shelves lined not with gold, but with cedar, a wood chosen not for its beauty, though it is beautiful, but for its quiet resistance to insects and its warm, resinous scent that seems to calm the mind during long hours of concentration. They do not work for fame, for power, or even for security. They work because they believe deeply, quietly, unshakably, that every word matters. Every thought once written deserves a chance to be read again, even if it takes 100 years, even if only 1 person ever reads it. Their devotion is not loud. It is in the way they handle a fragile scroll as if it were a sleeping child, in the way they pause to mend a tear with gum and papyrus before copying a single line, in the way they whisper corrections to themselves as they work, not to show off, but to stay true to the voice of the original writer. Some of them spend their days copying Greek tragedies, Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, their eyes straining in the soft light as they trace the elegant curves of each letter, matching the rhythm of the original as closely as possible, sometimes adding a small mark in the margin to indicate where an actor might pause for breath or where the chorus would sing. Others work on translations, bending over Egyptian medical texts written in hieratic script, puzzling over terms for herbs they've never seen, cross-referencing with botanical drawings and other scrolls, sometimes sending a note to the herb garden outside the Mausoleum to see if the plant still grows in the local soil. A young assistant, barely 16, sorts newly arrived scrolls by region, subject, and language. One from Syria, wrapped in oilcloth, carries a treatise on irrigation systems along the Euphrates. Another from India, nestled in silk, contains mathematical diagrams so precise they resemble star charts, with symbols for 0 that look like tiny moons. Each scroll is handled with ritual care and rolled slowly to avoid cracking the brittle papyrus, examined under angled light for tears, insect damage, or faded ink, then logged into the great catalog, the Pinax, with notes on its origin, condition, and content. Nothing is rushed. Nothing is discarded without careful consultation. Even a scroll that seems blank might hold writing visible only when held at a certain angle to the sun, a secret waiting to be rediscovered. Meals are taken in a shaded courtyard where fig trees drop ripe fruit onto stone benches, and the air smells of bread, its olives, and thyme. The keepers eat simply flatbread dipped in olive oil, cheese wrapped in vine leaves, else figs so sweet they stain the fingers, and they eat together. It's not as masters and servants, but as companions in a shared calling. Sometimes, over lunch, a quiet debate arises. A scribe argues that a certain verb in a philosophical text should be read as to illuminate, while a translator insists, means to reveal. They don't raise their voices. They gesture gently with their hands, quote other passages for context, and sometimes agree to leave both interpretations in the margin for future readers to consider. Laughter, when it comes, is soft and warm, often over a mistranslation that turned a serious medical warning into a love poem, or over a scribe's playful doodle of a cat chasing a mouse in the corner of a draft. In these moments, the library feels less like an institution and more like a home, a place where curiosity is nurtured, not policed, where mistakes are part of learning, and where the joy of understanding is shared, not hoarded. Among them moves the head librarian, first Xenodotus of Ephesus, later Callimachus of Cyrene, not as a ruler, but as a guide, a fellow traveler in the landscape of knowledge. He wears no special robes, carries no staff of office, and gives no orders. Instead, he listens. He walks the halls not to inspect, but to observe, the way a young scribe holds his reed too tightly, the way an older translator pauses over a Persian word with a look of recognition. He reads new arrivals, not for entertainment, but for connection. This Babylonian star chart, he might say gently, aligns with the Egyptian one we received last winter. Let's place them side by side in the astronomy wing. His greatest contribution is not a discovery, but a system. The Pinakes, a vast living catalog that organizes knowledge not just by subject, but by author, dialect, region, and even critical commentary. It is the first attempt to map human thought like a star chart, so that a student from Carthage, speaking broken Greek, could still find a medical text from Memphis, or a poet from Rhodes could compare versions of Sappho. He sees the library not as a vault, but as a bridge, and he spends his life building its planks, one careful note at a time. The air in the copying rooms is kept deliberately dry, using vents and shaded courtyards to prevent the papyrus from curling or molding in the humid coastal air. Sunlight filters through linen curtains dyed pale yellow or ochre, softening the glare and casting a warm golden glow that protects the ink from fading while still providing enough light to work by. At midday, when the heat grows heavy and the light too bright, the scribes pause. They fan themselves with half-finished scrolls, share water from a clay jug cooled in a shaded niche, sometimes recite poetry allowed to rest their eyes, a passage from Homer, a hymn to Apollo, a fragment of Sappho so fragile it exists in only 2 copies in the world. Their fingers are permanently stained with ink, not just on the tips, but deep in the lines of their skin, a quiet tattoo of their vocation. Some have been here for 30 years or more. They know where every scroll lives, how it smells. Some carry the scent of cedar. Others of myrrh or sandalwood, how brittle its edges have become with age. They speak of texts like old friends. Homer's on the 3rd shelf. Near the window he likes the light, or the medical scroll from Memphis is fragile. Handle it with both hands and never unroll it fully. Their knowledge is not written down. It lives in their hands, their memories, their daily rituals. They understand, in a way few others do, the true value of what they guard. A lost scroll is not just a piece of papyrus. It might be the only surviving copy of a play that made Athenians weep, a remedy for a fever that still kills children in distant villages, or a map of a river no one has sailed in centuries. So they handle each one with the care one might use for a sleeping child, with gentleness, with attention, with love. They mend tears with thin strips of fresh papyrus and natural gum, press warped scrolls under smooth stones overnight to flatten them, and store the most fragile in cedar chests lined with linen to keep away moths and moisture. Their work is invisible to the world outside, but without them, the library would be a silent tomb, a collection of words with no one to read them, no one to copy them, no one to carry them forward. They are the quiet pulse beneath the skin of this great dream, the unseen hands that keep the flame alive, and yet their work is never finished. For every scroll copied, 2 more arrive from distant ports. For every question answered, 3 more arise from the margins of newly translated texts. The library breathes, and they are its quiet lungs inhaling knowledge from every shore of the known world, exhaling it back through copies, translations, and teachings that travel as far as the scrolls themselves. They do not expect fame. They do not seek monuments. They simply believe that if a thought was worth writing once, it is worth preserving forever, even if no one reads it for 100 years. Even if its author is long forgotten, even if the language it's written in becomes unreadable, they preserve it anyway, as an act of faith in the future, as a quiet rebellion against the entropy of time. As the sun dips below the rooftops of Alexandria, casting long shadows across the marble floors and turning the harbor into a sheet of molten gold, the keepers begin their evening ritual. They roll up their day's work with meticulous care, tying each scroll with linen, thread dyed in soft blues or earthy ochres, and return them to their places on the cedar shelves, aligning them just so, never forcing a tight roll. They blow out the oil lamps one by one, leaving only a single flame burning in the main hall, a small, steady light to guard the silence through the night. The library settles into evening stillness, filled not with emptiness, but with the quiet presence of thousands of voices waiting to be heard again, thousands of thoughts waiting to spark new ones. It is a place of profound peace, of order, of care. But outside its walls, the world is changing. Ships still arrive with books, but also with soldiers, with rumors, with fear. Voices in the streets grow louder, sharper, more certain. New powers rise, less patient with questions, less tolerant of old ways, less willing to see value in a text that does not serve their vision of truth. The quiet rhythm of the shelves, so steady for so long, will soon meet the noise of history not with a single explosion, but with a slow, creeping pressure that even the most careful hands cannot hold back forever. The keepers sense it, though they do not speak of it. They work a little longer each night. They copy a few more lines. They hide the most fragile scrolls in inner rooms. They do what they have always done. They care. And as the last light fades from the western windows, one young scribe lingers, running his fingers over a newly copied scroll of Archimedes' work on spirals. He doesn't know it yet, but he is part of the last generation to work in the full light of the library's dream. He copies slowly, lovingly, as if the future depends on it, and in a way it does. What will he do when the world stops listening? Imagine the library not as a vault sealed against the world, but as a harbor living, breathing port where ideas from every known shore drift in on the tides of trade, diplomacy, and curiosity, coming to rest not in isolation, but in conversation. The air is thick with the scent of salt, cedar, and distant spices. The sound of waves against stone docks blends with the low murmur of scholars comparing texts in half a dozen languages. Ships arrive daily from Rhodes with marble and poetry, from Athens with olive oil and philosophy, from Babylon with star charts pressed into clay, from Memphis with papyrus scrolls wrapped in linen, and even rarely miraculously from distant ports in India, where monsoon winds carry ships laden with silk, pepper, and manuscripts, so strange they seem like dreams written in ink. With them come not just goods, but voices whispers of other ways of seeing, healing, counting, worshipping, and wondering. And in this harbor of thought, no voice is turned away. Each is unrolled, examined, and given a place not as a trophy of conquest, but as a guest at a table where the only requirement for entry is that it carries a piece of what it means to be human. A scroll from Persia arrives one morning, wrapped in layers of fine silk that still carry the faint golden scent of saffron and myrrh. It is carried ashore by a merchant whose hands are stained with ink and henna, and delivered to the library with a bow and a quiet request. Please, let it be read. Inside, the text is written in a flowing script that dances across the papyrus like water over stone. It contains detailed notes on surgery, how to stitch wounds with horsehair so fine it dissolves as the flesh heals, how to set broken bones using splints of reed bound with linen strips soaked in resin, how to mix antiseptics from crushed herbs that smell of earth and bitterness. A Greek physician, trained in the methods of Hippocrates, reads it with wide, unblinking eyes. He walks slowly to the medical wing, where Egyptian papyri on trauma care are kept, and spreads both texts side by side on a low table. For hours, he compares techniques, noting where the Persian methods are gentler, where the Egyptian ones are more precise. In the margin of his own notes, he writes in careful Greek, "They knew this too. Not they copied us, not they were primitive, but simply, they knew." It is a moment of humility, of recognition, two distant minds arriving at the same truth through different paths, now meeting in silence on a shared desk. From Babylon comes a clay tablet, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, carefully packed in straw, and sealed in a wax-coated leather pouch to survive the long journey. Its surface is covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed into damp clay centuries before Homer sang of Achilles. It holds star charts or chords of planetary movements, eclipses, comets meticulously logged night after night by skywatchers who believe the heavens spoke the will of the gods. The astronomers in the library do not dismiss it as primitive superstition, as some might elsewhere. Instead, they carry it to the observatory courtyard, lay it beside their own Greek calculations drawn on papyrus, and compare. What they find startles them. The Babylonians tracked the same comet that appeared last year centuries earlier with astonishing precision, predicting its return within days. They do not erase their own work. They do not mock the cuneiform. Instead, they copy the Babylonian data onto papyrus, translate the annotations as best they can, and add it to their growing archive of the sky. In doing so, they do not just preserve data, they honor a lineage of looking upward, of seeking order in the chaos of stars, of believing that the universe is knowable. Egyptian priests, though wary of Greek rule and its foreign gods, sometimes bring temple records to the library not as surrender, but as an act of cautious trust. These are not public texts, but sacred ones. Hymns chanted only at dawn. Rituals for guiding the dead through the duot. Lists of pharaohs stretching back into myth, where history and legend blur like ink and rain. The scholars do not treat them as curiosities. They study them with reverence, working with bilingual scribes who understand both Demotic and Greek, translating not just words but meanings. These texts are placed alongside Greek myths about gods who also died and rose again, Osiris and Dionysus. Isis and Demeter, not to prove one true and the other false, but to let them sit side by side, like neighbors sharing stories over a garden wall. No one claims superiority. Instead, a quiet understanding grows that different peoples have looked at the same mystery as death, rebirth, justice, the stars, and woven different but equally beautiful answers. The library becomes a place where truth is not singular, but plural, a mosaic made of many colored stones. Indian texts arrive less often, carried by merchants who have braved the monsoons and the deserts, their ships smelling of sandalwood and cardamom. When they do arrive, they cause a quiet excitement among the mathematicians and philosophers. One scroll, written on palm leaves bound with red thread, contains ideas so strange they seem like poetry disguised as numbers. It speaks of Shun Usiro not as mere emptiness, but as a number with its own place in the cosmic order, a placeholder that gives meaning to all other digits. The scholars gather in a shaded courtyard, passing the scroll from hand to hand. Some call it nonsense. How can nothing be something? Others sit in silence for hours, tracing the symbols in the dust with their fingers, until a slow dawning spreads across their faces. One young mathematician whispers, "If zero has a place, then numbers are not just counts, but positions." A system. They debate it for weeks, not with anger, but with wonder. And slowly, the idea takes root, a seed from the Ganges that will one day help build the architecture of modern mathematics. Even Jewish scholars from Jerusalem, traveling under Roman safe passage, bring their sacred writings, scrolls of Torah, prophets, and Psalms, written in Hebrew and Aramaic, languages few in Alexandria understand. But they are not turned away. Instead, a team of 70 translators, so the story goes, is assembled. Jews who know the holy texts by heart, Greeks who master the nuances of both languages, and scribes who can render the rhythm of Hebrew poetry into the flowing cadence of Greek prose. The work is slow, reverent, filled with pauses for prayer and discussion. The result is the Septuagint, the first major translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, not as an act of conversion, but of connection. Through it, others in the Mediterranean world encounter a tradition that speaks of one God, of justice for the widow and orphan, of a covenant written not on stone tablets but on the human heart. The library does not ask if this God is true. It asks only, does this voice matter? The answer is yes. The library becomes a place of quiet convergence, where knowledge is not ranked, but woven. A Persian map of rivers showing tributaries, floodplains, and irrigation canals is laid beside a Greek geographer's description of the same lands, and discrepancies become doorways to new understanding. A Carthaginian sailor's log, filled with notes on currents, winds, and coastal landmarks, is cross-referenced with Egyptian trade records listing shipments of cedar and lapis lazuli, revealing patterns of movement no single culture could have seen alone. Nothing is discarded as irrelevant. A recipe for dye, a love letter tucked inside a treaty, child's drawing on a scrap of papyrusol are considered threads in a larger tapestry, each adding color, texture, and humanity to the whole. And it's not just texts. Objects arrive too, carried in chests lined with straw, a Babylonian astrolabe with bronze rings that mimic the spheres of heaven, an Indian abacus with beads of ivory sliding on silk cords, an Egyptian surgical tool made of polished bronze, its edge still sharp after decades. These are not locked in display cases as curiosities. They are studied in workshops, handled with care, tested when possible. Scholars try to understand not just what they are, but how they were used, then what they reveal about the minds that made them. The astrolabe teaches them about Babylonian cosmology. The abacus reveals a different way of thinking about calculation. The surgical tool shows a precision that rivals their own. In these objects, they see not primitive or advanced, but different hand. In that difference, they find richness. The keepers don't judge. They collect. They connect. They ask not who wrote this, but what did this person see? What did they fear in the dark? What did they hope to preserve for those who would come after? In doing so, they create something unprecedented in human history. A global conversation, centuries before the word global existed, before empires dreamed of connecting continents, before maps showed more than coastlines and monsters. Here, in this harbor of thought, the world speaks to itself not in one voice, but in many and listens. Of course, much is missing. The voices of sub-Saharan Africa, of Nubia, of the Niger River kingdoms, do not reach these shelves. The songs of the Americas, the wisdom of the Andes, and the Amazon. The oral epics of Polynesia, those shores remain beyond the library's reach, hidden by oceans and silence. And even within its collection, some knowledge is filtered through Greek eyes, simplified or misunderstood. A ritual becomes a superstition, a myth becomes a fable. But within the limits of their world, they try genuinely, persistently, humbly to listen to as many voices as they can. They know they are not gathering all knowledge, only what the winds and ships have brought them, but they gather it with open hands. What makes the library extraordinary isn't just its size, though it is vast, but its openness. It doesn't ask, is this Greek? It doesn't ask, does this serve the king? It asks only, is this true? Is this useful? Is this human? And if the answer is yes, Evan, if the script is strange, even if the god has no name they recognize, even if the math seems like magic, it finds a place on the shelf, not in a corner, but in the light. It's not as an oddity, but as a companion. As twilight falls over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of rose and indigo, the last ship of the day unloads its cargo, sacks of grain for the city's ovens, jars of wine sealed with pitch, bundles of papyrus for the scribes. And then, carefully carried by two sailors, a wooden chest sealed with red wax, stamped with the sigil of Antioch. Inside, wrapped in linen so fine it feels like water, are 10 scrolls from a philosopher few have heard of, new thoughts on the nature of time, on whether it flows like a river or circles like the seasons. The head librarian receives them with a nod, runs his fingers over the wax seal, and places the chest in the receiving room. The scribes will begin copying them at dawn. But not all arrivals bring knowledge. Some bring tension, rumors of unrest in the streets, edicts from distant Rome, whispers of new sects that see old texts as dangerous. Some bring fear of change, of difference, of ideas that don't fit neatly into doctrine. And as the world grows louder outside, filled with certainties and shouts, the quiet harbor of the library will soon face waves it cannot calm with ink and papyrus alone. The sea that once brought voices may soon bring silence. Imagine a day in Alexandria when the air feels heavier than usual, not with the dry heat of summer, but with a different kind of weight, the kind that settles in the chest before a storm that never quite breaks. The harbor still bustles with its usual rhythm, gulls cry overhead, sailors shout across decks. Merchants haggle over sacks of grain and jars of wine and the scent of salt, fish. And baking bread drifts through the streets as it always has. Scholars still walk toward the library, their arms cradling scrolls wrapped in linen, their sandals whispering against sun-warmed stone. But something has shifted beneath the surface, like a current changing direction in deep water. The city is no longer just a crossroads of knowledge, a neutral ground where ideas from every shore could meet in peace. It has become a prized symbol of power, of identity, of control, and as such, it is no longer safe. The library, once a sanctuary, now stands at the center of invisible lines being drawn in the sand, and those who guard its shelves can feel the tension in the air like static before lightning. The first losses are small, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, quiet tragedies that leave no mark on history, only on the hearts of those who notice. A shelf in a back storeroom, weakened by years of humidity and the slow creep of termites, collapses during a summer storm. Rainwater seeps through a crack in the roof, pooling on the floor and soaking a dozen scrolls stored too close to the ground. They are not the most famous texts, no Homeric epics. No lost plays, but they contain medical notes from a physician in Memphis, star charts from a Babylonian apprentice, and a merchant's log detailing trade routes along the Red Sea. The keepers find them the next morning, their papyrus swollen and blackened at the edges, the ink bleeding into unreadable smudges.
Out.
No one speaks of it loudly. There are no public laments, no royal inquiries. The head librarian simply nods. And the team works in silence. They lay the salvageable scrolls in the sun to dry. Burn the ruined ones in a small clay brazier in the courtyard, the smoke smelling faintly of myrrh and regret. And add a single line to the master catalogue, lost to water. 3rd year of the reign of Ptolemy XII. It is not recorded as a tragedy, but as a fact like noting the tide or the phase of the moon. Yet in that quiet notation lies the first crack in the dream, the realization that even the most carefully guarded knowledge is fragile, and time left unchecked will wear it away grain by grain. Then comes the fire, not the great roaring conflagration of later legend, the one poets would blame on a single villain or a single night, but something smaller, messier, born not of malice, but of chaos. It is 48 BCE, and Julius Caesar is in Alexandria, embroiled in the tangled politics of the Ptolemaic court. His ships are docked in the harbor when the Egyptian fleet attacks. To defend himself, Caesar orders his men to set fire to the enemy vessels. The flames, fed by dry wood and wind off the sea, leap from ship to ship and then to the docks, to the warehouses lining the shore. Some of those warehouses hold grain, yes, but others hold scrolls, duplicates sent from the main library for safekeeping.
Originals waiting to be copied.
Foreign texts recently arrived from Rhodes and Antioch. The fire does not target the library itself. No soldier marches through its halls with torch in hand. But in the confusion of war, in the smoke and shouting and panic, carelessness becomes its own kind of violence. The flames do not need intent to destroy. They consume what is near, and what is near includes voices that will never speak again. When the smoke clears, the harbor smells of charred wood and salt and something else, something dry and papery, like the ghost of words turned to ash. The library's outer annexes are untouched, but the loss is real. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of texts gone in a single afternoon, not because anyone wanted them gone, but because the world was too busy with power to notice what it was burning. The keepers say little. They do not gather to mourn, do not write angry letters to Rome. Instead, they sweep ash from the courtyards with brooms of bundled reeds, their faces calm, their movements deliberate. They unroll scrolls that survived but were dampened by seawater, pressing them between clean linen and smooth stones to flatten them. They re-roll what can be saved, tie them with fresh thread, and return them to the shelves. But in the evenings, after the lamps are lit and the others have gone home, some linger. An old scribe sits alone in the medical wing, running his fingers over a gap in the shelf where a Persian surgical text once rested. A young apprentice stands in the astronomy room, staring at a blank space where a Babylonian comet log should be. They do not weep, but their silence is heavy. They know in a way only those who live among texts can know that once a scroll is gone, it doesn't just disappear. It takes with it every question it might have answered, every cure it might have offered, every connection it might have sparked between two distant minds. Its absence is not empty. It is full of what could have been. Political winds shift like tides, slow at first, then unstoppable. Roman influence grows, not with armies alone, but with bureaucracy, with loyalty oaths, with the quiet pressure of a distant capital that measures value in tribute and obedience, not in wisdom or wonder. Greek scholars still work in the Mauseon, still debate under the olive trees. But their patrons, once Ptolemaic kings who saw philosophy as a crown jewel now, answer to emperors in Rome who care more about grain, shipments, and military loyalty than about whether Euclid's fifth postulate can be proven. Funding slows. The stipends for scribes are reduced, then delayed. New scrolls arrive less often. Merchants are wary of carrying non-essential cargo through increasingly tense waters. The copying rooms, once filled with the soft scratch of a dozen reeds, grow quieter. One scribe retires to a small farm outside the city and isn't replaced. The budget won't allow it. Then another falls ill and passes away, and his apprentice is reassigned to tax records. The shelves are still full, but the pulse of the place weakens, like a heartbeat growing faint. Yet the library endures. Not as it once was in its golden age when every ship brought new voices, When every debate felt like a step toward universal understanding, but as it can be, pared down, humbler, more resilient, the core collection remains intact. Homer, Plato, the great medical and astronomical texts. Scholars still come from across the Mediterranean, some out of habit, some out of hope, some simply because there is nowhere else like it. They read, they debate, they copy what they can. The dream isn't dead, it is only dimmed. Like a lamp running low on oil, its flame smaller, but still steady, casting long shadows but refusing to go out. There is still warmth here, still light, just less of it, and harder to see from the outside. What's lost isn't always burned. Sometimes it vanishes more quietly, more insidiously. A scroll is misfiled during a reorganization and never found again's absence, unnoticed for years, until someone needs it and discovers only an empty space. A translator working on a rare Phoenician trade ledger dies suddenly of fever, and his notes, half finished, are packed away and forgotten. A royal decree, issued not by a tyrant, but by a nervous administrator, bans the copying of foreign theological texts, deemed confusing to public order, and the shelves that once held Egyptian hymns and Persian prayers are quietly emptied, not by fire, not by soldiers, but by silence. The texts aren't destroyed, they're simply removed, stored in back rooms, left to gather dust. And in that silence, they begin to fade from memory as if they never existed at all. The keepers adapt. They always have. They learn to read the mood of the city like a weather vane. Sensitive work texts on magic, on foreign gods, on controversial philosophy. I move to inner rooms with no windows, hidden behind false shelves or wrapped in plain linen and labeled as agricultural records. Fragile originals are recopied onto sturdier papyrus, made from thicker reeds, their ink mixed with extra gum to resist fading. They teach their apprentices not just to write beautifully, but to remember to carry key passages in their minds, to recite star charts by heart, to know the structure of a medical text so well that even if the scroll is lost, the knowledge lives in their breath. Their courage isn't loud or dramatic, doesn't make history books. It is in the steady hand that copies one more line late into the night, even when no one seems to be watching, even when the world outside no longer seems to care. It is in the quiet act of preservation as resistance, and still life goes on. Children laugh as they chase each other past the library gates, their bare feet kicking up dust. Fishermen sell their morning catch in the square, their voices rough and warm. Bread bakes in clay ovens, wine ferments in earthen jars, lovers meet in shaded courtyards. The sun rises and sets as it always has, indifferent to human triumphs and losses. The world doesn't stop for grief, it moves around it, like water flowing around a stone in a river. But the stone remains, so does the weight of what's missing. The hollow spaces on the shelves, the unanswered questions, the voices that fell silent not with a cry but with a sigh. It's easy to imagine destruction as sudden, a single blaze, a single decree, a mob with torches. That kind of loss is clean, dramatic, easy to blame. But real loss is often slower, quieter, more devastating because it goes unnoticed until it's too late. It's the slow fading of attention, the quiet withdrawal of support, the moment when no one is left who knows how to read a certain script or understand a certain symbol. It's the apprentice who never learns the old dialect because there's no one to teach it. It's the scroll that sits untouched for decades until the papyrus crumbles at a touch. It's the world forgetting why it ever cared. And yet, even in this thinning light, the library holds on, not as a fortress of stone and cedar, but as a promise whispered from one generation to the next, that knowledge is worth protecting, even when the world forgets why. That every word matters. That someone, someday, might need this one fragile scroll to heal, to understand, to hope. But promises, however tender, however true, cannot shield forever. Stone cracks, cedar rots, ink fades. And as decades pass, new voices rise in the city, voices that speak with certainty, not curiosity, with purity, not plurality. Voices that see the old texts not as wisdom, but as danger, not as bridges, but as idols. And among the last to walk the halls of this fading dream is a woman whose light, clear, steady, rational will shine brightly for a time and then be extinguished. Her name is Hypatia. Her story is not just hers, it is the library's last echo. Imagine a winter evening in Alexandria, long after the library's golden age has faded into memory. The streets are quieter, now not empty, but hushed, as if the city itself is holding its breath. The harbor still hums with the low murmur of ships docking and sailors calling to one another. But the great debates that once echoed through the halls of the Maushan have grown fewer, more cautious, more private. The wind off the Mediterranean carries not just salt, but a new kind of chill one that has less to do with the season and more with the slow hardening of hearts. And in a modest house near the Canopic Way, its courtyard shaded by a single olive tree whose leaves tremble in the breeze, a woman lights a single oil lamp. The flame flickers, then steadies, casting a soft golden circle on the table before her. She unrolls a scroll on Geometry Diaphantus, perhaps, or Apollonius, and begins to read. Her fingers tracing the curves of conic sections as if they were paths through a familiar landscape. Outside, the world grows louder with certainty. Inside there is only the quiet companionship of reason. Her name is Hypatia. She is not a queen draped in silk, not a warrior clad in armor, not yet a saint enshrined in stained glass. She is simply a teacher, philosopher, a mathematician. A woman who believes that clarity is the highest form of kindness. Students gather in her courtyard not because she promises them power, wealth, or salvation, but because she offers something rarer, understanding. In a time when voices grow sharper, when truth is claimed rather than sought, her voice remains steady, calm, rooted in the ancient soil of reason. She does not perform wisdom, she practices it. She listens before she speaks. She corrects errors not with scorn, but with a gentle redirection. Look again, what do you see now? Her presence is not commanding, but grounding. In her company, the chaos of the world seems to recede, if only for an hour, replaced by the quiet order of a well-constructed proof or the elegant symmetry of planetary motion. She walks through the city in simple wool robes, dyed in earthy tones that blend with the dust of the streets, her dark hair tied back with a plain cord, her sandals worn but clean. Often a student walks beside her, sometimes a young man from Athens, sometimes a Christian deacon curious about astronomy, sometimes a foreign merchant's son with a hunger for numbers, and they speak not of politics or gods, but of conic sections, of the motion of Mars, of whether infinity can be divided. She teaches at the Serapeum, a so-called daughter library, a grand temple-turned academy that still stands when the great library's main halls have grown sparse, their shelves half empty, their courtyards overgrown. There in a room lit by high windows that catch the morning sun, she lectures on Ptolemy's Almagest, unpacking the complex machinery of epicycles and deferents that explain the wandering stars, on Diaphantus equations where numbers dance in patterns no one has fully mapped, on Plato's dialogues where justice is not a law, but a harmony of the soul. Her classroom is open to all pagans who still honor the old gods, Christians who seek knowledge within faith, foreigners who speak broken Greek but sharp minds. To her, knowledge has no creed, no nationality, no gender. It simply isn't. It belongs to anyone willing to work for it. The air in Alexandria is thick with tension, like the stillness before a storm that never breaks, but lingers, heavy and suffocating. The old gods are fading not with a roar, but with Asia's temples stand empty, and their statues gather dust. New churches rise where sacred groves once stood, their bells replacing the chants of priests. Bishops speak from pulpits of purity, of separation, of the dangers of pagan wisdom. Mobs gather in the squares, not over bread or taxes, but over symbols, over which stories are allowed to be told, which questions are permitted to be asked. And in this climate, a woman like Hypatia, educated, independent, moving freely in public spaces, refusing to convert, refusing to be silent, becomes more than a scholar. She becomes a symbol. Not of rebellion, she never raises a fist or writes a manifesto, but of a world that is slipping away, a world where inquiry was sacred, where doubt was the first step toward truth, where a woman's mind was as welcome as a man's in the halls of learning. To some she is a beacon, to others she is a threat, not because of what she does, but because of what she represents, a past that valued questions over answers, curiosity over certainty, dialogue over dogma. Yet Hypatia does not raise her voice. She does not retreat behind walls or cloak her teachings in allegory. She corrects a student's diagram with a gentle hand, her finger tracing the curve of a parabola with the same care a mother might use to smooth a child's hair. She pauses before dawn to watch the stars not as omens, but as equations written in light and notes their positions in a small leather-bound journal. She writes letters to friends in distant cities, Cyrene, Athens, even as far as Ramnot, about the rising tensions in the streets. But about the beauty of a newly discovered proof, the elegance of a geometric construction, the joy of a student who finally understood the motion of the spheres. Her life is not dramatic in the way history loves. It is disciplined, quiet, devoted. She rises early, teaches all day, reads late into the night, and sleeps lightly. Always aware of the world beyond her walls, but never ruled by fear. She believes, perhaps too deeply, that reason is a flame that cannot be extinguished, even in the darkest times. Her students remember the way she spoke. Not to impress, not to dominate, but to illuminate. Truth, she would say, her voice low and steady, is not owned by anyone, either by priests, nor kings, nor philosophers. It is found by those who are patient enough to look, humble enough to doubt, and brave enough to follow the evidence wherever it leads. In her presence, fear softened. Doubt did not feel like weakness, but like the first step on a path. The world, for a moment, felt less chaotic, less arbitrary, more like a cosmos than a chaos. Even the most anxious student would leave her courtyard with a sense of calm, as if they had been given not just knowledge but a compass for navigating uncertainty. That was her gift, not just to teach, but to restore trust in the mind, in the world, in the possibility of understanding. But outside her circle, the city grows less forgiving. Rumors spread like smoke through narrow alleys that she practices magic, that she consults demons, that she whispers against the bishop, powerful bishop, Cyril. Warns from the pulpit, the pagan learning leads souls astray, that philosophy is a snare for the faithful, that the old ways must be cleansed from the city. A mob gathers not because Hypatia has done anything violent, not because she has spoken against the church, but because she represents what they fear, a past that valued open inquiry, a woman who refuses to be silent, a mind that asks why, instead of accepting because. In a time of rising certainty, her very existence becomes a provocation, not for what she says, but for what she embodies. The idea that knowledge should be free, shared, and questioned. Still, she does not hide. She continues to teach. She walks to the public baths, to the market for bread and olives, to the lecture hall at the Serapeum, her head high, her step calm. She believes, perhaps with the quiet stubbornness of all true scholars, that reason can survive even in unreasonable times. That truth does not need protection from the world, only witnesses. She trusts that the city, at its core, still values learning. She does not see the storm gathering, not because she is blind, but because she refuses to live in fear. The night before the final day, she copies a passage from Archimedes into her private notebook of proof about spirals, about how motion and geometry intertwine. The ink is dark, the letters precise, each stroke deliberate. She blows gently on the page to dry it, then closes the book, its leather cover worn soft by years of use. The lamp flickers. Shadows dance on the wall like old ghosts, the ghosts of Euclid, of Ptolemy, of all the thinkers who came before her. She does not know it is the last night, but the air feels heavier, as if the world is holding its breath. What makes her story so haunting is not the violence that ends it, terrible as it is, but the quiet dignity that precedes it. She is not a martyr by choice, but by circumstance. She does not seek death, she seeks understanding. Her death is not the end of the library in a literal sense, the Serapeum still stands. Scrolls still exist, but it is the end of its spirit. It is the moment when the world stops listening to the kind of mind that asks, why, instead of who's to blame. When curiosity is replaced by suspicion, when dialogue gives way to dogma, when a woman's voice in the public square becomes not a gift but a threat. After she is gone, no one replaces her, not because there are no other scholars, but because the space for them has vanished. The lecture halls fall silent. Scrolls are moved to hidden rooms, or left to gather dust in forgotten corners. The Serapeum is eventually closed, its statues toppled, its books scattered or burned. The dream of a shared, rational, open knowledge, the dream that began with Ptolemy's quiet ambition retreats into monasteries, to private collections, into the fragile memory of those who once sat in her courtyard and felt, for a moment, that the world made sense. But for a little while, her candle burned, and in that light, steady, clear, unwavering, the library, though wounded, though diminished, still lived. It lived in the way she taught a student to see the stars, not as gods, but as bodies in motion. It lived in the proof she copied with care, in the letter she wrote about the joy of discovery. It lived in the simple act of a woman walking through the city, unafraid, thinking aloud. As the city sleeps that night, no one notices the last flame go out. The wind carries ash across the rooftops. The sea keeps its rhythm. Life goes on. But somewhere, far away, in a quiet room in Byzantium, a monk copies a geometry text by lamplight. His hand is steady, his script careful. And in the margin, next to a theorem on conic sections, he writes a single name, Hypodionot, as a saint, not as a victim, but as a witness. A reminder that once, in a city by the sea, a woman dared to think, to teach, to believe in reason. The world moves on. Not everything is lost. Imagine the library not as it once was in its golden age. Live with the rustle of scrolls, the murmur of debate, the steady rhythm of copying, but as it becomes in the decades after Hypatia's death, a place of echoes. The shelves are still there, carved from cedar and worn smooth by centuries of careful hands. The marble columns still stand, their fluted surfaces catching the afternoon light like silent sentinels. The courtyards still hold the scent of fig trees and dry earth. But the air feels different, keener, quieter, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath, waiting for a sound that will never come again. The great dream of gathering all human knowledge under one roof has not ended in a single dramatic blaze, as later poets would claim, but in a slow, patient unraveling, like a scroll left too long in the sun. Its fibers drying, its edges curling, its ink fading until the words become ghosts on the page. There is no final battle, no last librarian locking the door. There is only a gradual dimming, a softening of purpose, a world turning its attention elsewhere, until the library is no longer a living heart, but a memory wrapped in stone. After Hypatia's death, fear settles over Alexandria like fine dust so. Light, you barely notice it at first, but impossible to shake once it's in your lungs. Scholars who once walked openly through the streets, debating philosophy with strangers, now speak in hushed tones behind closed doors. Their gatherings grow smaller, their texts hidden beneath floorboards, or wrapped in plain linen and labeled as agricultural records. Some leave the city entirely, carrying what scrolls they can in chests, lined with cedar shavings texts on astronomy, medicine, geometry, hoping to find refuge in Athens. In Antioch, in distant monasteries where reason might still be honored. Others stay, but go silent. They stop teaching. They stop copying. They tuck their most precious scrolls into clay jars sealed with wax and bury them beneath courtyards, beneath fig trees, beneath the very stones of their homes, as if the earth itself might remember what the world has forgotten. The Mauseon still stands, its white marble gleaming in the sun, but its halls are emptier now, its courtyards overgrown with weeds, its debates reduced to whispers between two old friends who meet at dawn, just to feel for a moment that they are not alone in remembering. The Serapeum, the so-called daughter library, once a temple too, Serapis transformed into a vibrant center of learning, becomes a target not for what it is, but for what it represents. To the new order, it is not a place of knowledge, but a fortress of the old ways, a symbol of pagan resistance in a city increasingly defined by a single faith. In 391 CE, under the authority of Bishop Theophilus and with the tacit approval of Rome, a mob gathers at its gates. They are not soldiers, but citizens, shopkeepers, laborers. Young men stirred by sermons that call the old gods demons and philosophy, deception, they storm the building not with strategy, but with fervor. Statues of Serapis and Athena are pulled from their pedestals and shattered on the steps. Altars are smashed. Mosaics are pried from the floors, and the scrolls stored in its annexes. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, are either thrown into bonfires in the courtyard or scattered to the wind, their pages fluttering like wounded birds before landing in gutters, on rooftops, in the sea. No official record calls it the destruction of the library. To those in power, it is simply the cleansing of an old error, the removal of a spiritual infection. But for those who knew its shelves, who once traced their fingers over a Babylonian star chart or debated Plato and its colonnades, it is a wound. Not loud, not sudden, but deep, slow healing, and permanent. But for those who knew its shelves, it is a wound that does not bleed, but aches. It's not loud, not sudden, but deep, carved into the soul of anyone who once found solace there. A student who once studied astronomy in the Serapeum's upper chamber now walks past the ruins on his way to the market and looks away, his eyes fixed on the ground, as if the sight of broken columns might pull him back into a grief he can no longer afford. As an old scribe, too frail to flee, too poor to hide, watches from a rooftop across the street as smoke curls into the twilight sky, carrying with it the ashes of texts he copied with his own hands decades ago. He does not cry. He has no tears left. He simply turns, wraps his thin shawl tighter around his shoulders, and walks home through the gathering dark. Carrying one small scroll tucked inside his tunic, the last thing he could save, a fragment of Euclid's Elements, its edges frayed, its ink smudged, but still legible. It is not a grand act of heroism. It is a quiet act of love. And in that small gesture, the library lives one more day. The main library, if it still exists in any recognizable form, fades not with a scream, but with a sigh. There is no grand funeral, no public mourning, no royal decree marking its end. It simply stops being replenished. No new ships bring scrolls from distant ports. No young scribes arrive, eager to learn the art of copying. No scholars come to consult its archives. It stops being visited, not out of malice, but out of indifference. And slowly, it stops being remembered as a living place. Its collection, what remains, is absorbed into private hands, lost to neglect, or repurposed out of necessity. Papyrus is expensive, after all, and in a world where survival trumps scholarship, old scrolls are sometimes scraped clean with pumice stone, their original words erased to make room for new ones, tax records, church hymns, personal letters. The past literally becomes the page for the future, its voice overwritten, its memory buried beneath fresh ink. A medical text by Galen might become a list of grain shipments. A poem by Sappho might be reborn as a prayer. The irony is quiet, but devastating. The very material that once carried knowledge forward becomes the instrument of its erasure. And yet, the destruction is never total. Not because the buildings survive, most do not, but because the act of preservation continues, just elsewhere in smaller, quieter ways. A monk in a desert monastery near the Nile copies a medical text by lamplight. His hands steady, despite the cold, his script careful despite his exhaustion, because he believes healing is sacred, regardless of who first wrote the remedy. A merchant in Antioch hides a philosophy scroll in his chest of silks, carrying it across borders not for profit, but because he once read a line that changed how he saw the world, and he cannot bear to let it vanish. A teacher in Athens, long after the schools have closed, recites a poem from memory to a single student under an olive tree, passing it down not on papyrus, but on breath, knowing that if the student remembers it, the poem lives. These acts leave no monuments. They are not recorded in chronicles, but they are the true lifeline of civilization, the quiet, stubborn refusal to let the flame go out. What is lost is not just paper and ink, not just the physical object, but something far more fragile: context. A scroll without its catalog, note without the Pinake's entry that tells you who wrote it, when, and why Bic. Comes an orphan, adrift in time. Demantis, a mathematical proof, without its commentary, without the debates that shaped it. Its humanity, its connection to the mind that dreamed it. Play by Menander, stripped of its performance tradition, its music, its audience's laughter, becomes silent, a skeleton without flesh. The library was never just a storage room for texts. It was a conversation, a living, breathing dialogue across centuries and cultures, where a Greek could read an Egyptian, a Persian could debate an Indian, all under one roof. And when that conversation stops, even the words that survive grow lonelier, like voices calling into an empty room. Still, life goes on in Alexandria. Fishermen haul in their nets at dawn, their hands rough from salt and rope. Children laugh as they chase each other past the ruins of the Serapeum, their bare feet kicking up dust that once held the ashes of scrolls. Bread is baked, water is drawn from the well. Lovers meet in shaded alleys. The sea keeps its rhythm tides rising and falling, waves whispering against stone as it has for millennia. The city forgets, not out of malice, not out of cruelty, but because survival demands it. You cannot mourn forever when bread must be baked, when children must be fed, when the world keeps turning, whether you are ready or not. Grief is a luxury for the secure. And in a world growing more uncertain by the day, the past becomes a weight too heavy to carry. In time, as it always does, softens the edges. The sharp pain of loss dulls into a quiet ache, then into a vague sense of something missing. The columns of the Serapeum, once sacred, become climbing frames for boys who know nothing of Serapis or Hypatia. The stones of the Mausian are carted away and reused in new buildings, a church, a bathhouse, a house for a merchant who never read a scroll in his life. The ash is swept away by wind and rain, carried out to sea or buried under new streets. Nothing dramatic remains, no grand ruins, no smoking craters, just fragments, a broken column half buried in sand, a shard of pottery with a faded Greek letter, a patch of mosaic under a fig tree. They wait, patient and silent, for someone to stop, to wonder, to ask what was here, who lived here, what did they know? But the silence is not empty. It is full, overflowing with what is missing. Every empty shelf in a forgotten storeroom, every blank space in a catalog where a title once stood, every line that ends mid-sentence because the rest of the scroll turned to dust, these are the true ashes of Alexandria. Not the smoke of fire, not the roar of mobs, but the quiet residue of attention withdrawn, of care abandoned, of a world that stopped listening. And yet even in this fading, something endures, not in stone, not in papyrus, but in the idea itself. The idea that such a place could exist at all, that humans, flawed and fleeting as they are, once tried, however imperfectly, however briefly, to gather all knowledge under one roof. Not to control it, not to hoard it, but to share it, to protect it, to let it breathe. That dream does not burn, it does not die. It waits in the hands of a monk, in the memory of a teacher, in the heart of anyone who still believes that knowledge is worth saving. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting long shadows across the ruins, the sea turns gold, then rose, then deep indigo. The wind carries the scent of salt in distant lands. But far to the east, in a city of golden domes and marble courtyards, Baghdad, under the Abbasid Khalifa, new library is rising. The House of Wisdom. And in its halls, lit by oil lamps and filled with the soft scratch of pens, a scholar opens a scroll. Copied from a copy of a text once shelved in Alexandria, the conversation is not over, it has only changed hands. Imagine a quiet room in Constantinople, centuries after Alexandria's light has dimmed into legend. Rain taps softly against the leaded glass of a high dome, its rhythm steady as a heartbeat. While inside, the air is still cool and scented with beeswax and aged parchment. A monk sits hunched over a wooden desk, his robe worn thin at the elbows, his fingers stained with ink that has seeped into the lines of his skin like a second language. His hand is steady as he copies a Greek text on astronomy, perhaps Ptolemy's Almagest. Perhaps a commentary by Theon of Alexandria, his reed pen gliding across smooth vellum with the quiet confidence of someone who has done this 1,000 times before. The ink is dark, almost black, mixed with gum to keep it from bleeding, and the letters flow in elegant, measured curves. He doesn't know that the original scroll he's copying once rested on a cedar shelf in a sunlit hall by the Mediterranean, handled by scholars who debated the motion of the stars under olive trees. But he senses its importance, not because of its age, but because of its clarity, its logic, its quiet insistence that the universe is knowable. And so, in the margin, in a smaller hand, he adds a note from the Library of the Ancients. It is not a citation for scholars, but a whisper of gratitude to ghosts he's never met. The knowledge did not vanish when Alexandria fell, scattered not in a single cataclysm, but in a slow, patient diaspora, like seeds carried by wind, water, and wandering feet across deserts, mountains, and seas. Some seeds landed on barren rock and perished. Others found fertile ground and took root, growing into new forests of thought. In the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, under vaulted ceilings that echo with the murmur of a dozen languages, scholars gather not as rivals, but as collaborators in a shared quest. They translate not just Greek texts, Aristotle on logic, Galen on medicine, Euclid on geometry, but also Persian star charts, Indian mathematical treatises, and Syriac commentaries on philosophy, weaving them all into a single, living tapestry of human understanding. A physician reads Galen's descriptions of the humors, then compares them with an Indian treatise on pulse diagnosis that speaks of energy channels and seasonal balance. And in that comparison, he finds not contradiction, but complement. A mathematician studies Euclid's axioms, then builds upon them with the Indian concept of shunya siranat as emptiness, but as a placeholder that gives structure to all numbers, a silent pivot around which the entire system turns. The spirit of Alexandria lives here not in marble halls or royal patronage, but in curiosity that refuses borders, in the quiet belief that truth, wherever it is found, belongs to everyone. In Cordoba, under the soft, golden glow of lanterns hanging from horseshoe arches, another scribe works late into the night in the caliph's library, a space so vast it is said to hold hundreds of thousands of volumes, some whispering that it even surpasses Alexandria in scale. The air is thick with the scent of ink, leather, and the faint sweetness of orange blossoms drifting in from the courtyard. Here, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars sit side by side at long tables, their hands moving in unison as they translate, debate, and preserve. A Jewish philosopher renders Aristotle into Arabic, a Christian monk copies his work into Latin, and a Muslim astronomer adds marginal notes comparing Ptolemy's star charts with observations made from the rooftops of the city. They call it la convivencia, existence, not as an ideal, but as a daily practice, a rhythm of mutual respect, born not of uniformity, but of shared reverence for the written word. In this shared space, lit by oil lamps and warmed by the hum of quiet collaboration, the dream of a universal library breathes again, not as a monument, but as a living conversation across faiths, languages, and centuries. Even in the farthest corners of the known world, fragments survive, carried by hands that may never have heard of Alexandria, but who instinctively understood its mission. In a monastery perched on the banks of the River Shannon in Ireland, a monk in Clonmacnoise copies a medical text by lamplight, his Latin shaky, his Greek almost non-existent, but his faith in healing absolute. He doesn't understand every term he pars sanguis, but he copies them faithfully, believing that even words he cannot pronounce might one day save a life. In the highlands of Ethiopia, in the ancient city of Aksum, a priest chants a psalm in Ge'ez during evening vespers, his voice rising and falling in a melody passed down for generations. That psalm is a translation of a Hebrew text, yes, but its lineage traces back through the Septuagint, the Greek version first rendered in Alexandria centuries before, by scholars who believed that sacred words should be accessible to all who sought them. The chain is fragile, stretched thin by distance, time, and silence, but it is unbroken. Each link is a quiet act of trust, that what was written once is worth preserving, even if the world forgets why. These new libraries are not replicas of Alexandria. They have their own rhythms, their own silences, their own reasons for being. The House of Wisdom serves an empire that values knowledge as power. The Libra thrives under a caliphate that sees scholarship as devotion. The monasteries of Ireland preserve texts as acts of piety. But they share one essential thing with Alexandria, the quiet, unshakable belief that knowledge is worth saving. Even when the world seems to forget it, even when no one is watching, even when the future feels uncertain. They don't hoard texts like treasure. They share them, copy them, teach them. A student in Baghdad learns geometry from a translated Euclid, then teaches it to a traveler from Toledo who stops in the city to trade silks. That traveler carries the knowledge across the Pyrenees to a cathedral school in France, where a young scholar copies it into a new manuscript, adding his own notes in the margins. The echo grows, not loud, but persistent, like ripples spreading across a still pond. Of course, much is lost in translation, not just words, but worlds. A philosophical argument about the nature of the soul becomes a dry theological formula stripped of its original wonder. A poem by Sappho, once sung to the lyre with trembling voice and tears in the eyes, becomes a series of fragmented lines on a page. Its music gone, its context buried. A medical remedy loses its ritual, its timing, its connection to the seasons. But even imperfect copies carry sparks-teeny embers of the original fire. And sometimes, a single spark is enough to relight a flame in a mind hungry for light. A misread word might lead to a new discovery. A misunderstood diagram might inspire a fresh perspective. The transmission is never perfect, but it is human, and in its imperfection, it remains alive. The keepers in these new centers know they are custodians, not owners. They mend torn pages with linen thread dyed to match the original. They store scrolls in cedar chests lined with lavender to keep away moths and moisture. They teach their apprentices not just to write beautifully, but to respect the weight of what they copy, to handle each page as if it were a letter from a distant ancestor, full of love and warning and hope. Their work is quiet, unseen by the world outside their walls, rarely celebrated in chronicles or songs. But it is how the world remembers. It is how a line of poetry survives 1,000 years of war. It is how a geometric proof crosses deserts and seas. It is how the past speaks to the future, one careful copy at a time. And it's not just books that survives the methods, the habits of mind. Cataloging returns, not as the Pinakes, but as lists and monastery inventories. Cross-referencing lives on in marginal notes that compare one text to another. Translating becomes a sacred art, practiced with humility and care. Debating once the heartbeat of the Mausian continues in lecture halls from Baghdad to Paris. It's not to win, but to understand. The idea that knowledge should be organized, questioned. Shared that too is an echo of Alexandria's dream, not as a grand declaration, but as a quiet practice passed from hand to hand, mind to mind. No single place holds it all anymore. There is no one roof under which all human thought gathers. But together, these libraries scattered across continents and centuries form a network, a living memory woven from countless threads of care. The center has shifted from Alexandria to Baghdad to Cordoba to Constantinople to Paris, but the circle remains. The conversation continues, even if the voices change, even if the language shifts, even if the names are forgotten. What's remarkable isn't that Alexandria felt it was perhaps inevitable. What's astonishing is that its spirit refused to die. It didn't need marble halls or royal decrees. It only needed one person, in one quiet room, who believed that a single thought written on fragile papyrus, spoken in a dying dialect, sketched in the dust was worth saving. That belief, repeated across centuries and continents, is what kept the flame alive. As lamplight flickers in Baghdad, in Cordoba, and Constantinople, like the world keeps turning, empires rise and fall, wars rage and fade, cities burn and rebuild. But in those rooms, time slows, because someone is still reading, still copying, still caring. Their hands may be different, their gods may have new names, their languages may be strange to the scholars of old, but their purpose is the same. And yet, even as knowledge spreads wider than ever before, a new kind of loss begins to grow, not of texts, but of memory. People use the ideas zero, geometry, medicine, logic, but forget where they came from. The name Alexandria becomes a whisper, then a myth, then a blank space in the mind. Scholars cite Euclid, but not the scribes who saved him. Physicians use Galen's methods, but never wonder how his words crossed the sea. The chain is still there, but fewer people trace it back. And soon, the world will begin to wonder, did it even exist? Was there really a place where all knowledge gathered under one roof? Or was it just a dream beautiful but impossible? Imagine a scholar in the 12th century, hunched over a candlelit desk in a monastery somewhere in northern France, his breath visible in the cold winter air, his fingers stiff from the chill but still steady enough to turn the brittle pages of an old manuscript. The ink is faded, the Latin slightly archaic, but one phrase catches his eye, as preserved in the great Library of Alexandria. He pauses, frowns, leans closer as if proximity might bring clarity. Was it real? just a poet's dream, a place too perfect to have ever existed in the messy, uncertain world of human history. The details he's heard are hazy. It's almost dreamlike. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, lining cedar shelves. Scholars from Greece, Persia, India, and Egypt debating under colonnades. A king who valued words more than gold. Who built not a palace of conquest, but a sanctuary of curiosity. It sounds less like history and more like myth-like. Atlantis sinking beneath the waves, or El Dorado shimmering in the jungles of an uncharted continent. And yet, something in the way the phrase is used, not as legend, but as fact. As a quiet citation in a medical treatise or an astronomical table makes him wonder, could such a place have truly existed? And if it did, what else have we lost that we don't even know is gone? And yet, traces are they're not grand monuments, not surviving buildings, but small, stubborn fragments embedded in the texts that did survive. A medical text from the 9th century copied in Baghdad cites a remedy for fever from the Egyptian collection, as held in the royal library. A star chart from Byzantium, its margins crowded with notes in 3 languages. Adds in a careful hand, as recorded in the Alexandrian archives during the reign of Ptolemy III. A philosopher in late antiquity quotes a line from a comedy by Menander, now lost everywhere else in the world, but appends a quiet footnote. Once held in the Royal Library, Shelf 7, Section Medical and Theatrical, these are not proofs in the modern sense. They are whispers. Footprints in dry sand, nearly erased by wind, but still faintly visible to those who know how to look. They do not reconstruct the library, but they confirm its shadow. They tell us that it was not only imagined, it was used, referenced, relied upon. It was real enough to leave echoes in the minds of those who never saw it. Over time, as centuries pass, and the last eyewitnesses fade into dust, the library becomes less a physical place, and more a symbol not of what was, but of what could have been. Writers no longer speak of it to recount history, but to mourn possibility. A Renaissance humanist sighs in a letter, "If only those books had survived, we might understand the stars with the clarity of the ancients. Heal the sick with remedies, now lost to time, govern with the wisdom of those who saw the world whole." A poet in the 18th century writes of the silent shelves where all knowledge once slept, not as a record, but as a lament. The library transforms into a mirror reflecting not its own past, but the present's longing for wholeness, for connection. For a time when knowledge was not fragmented into disciplines, borders, or ideologies, it becomes the dream of unity in an age of division, the hope of preservation in an era of loss. And in that transformation, it grows more powerful as a myth than it ever was as a building. Legends grow around its absence, filling the void with wonder. Some say it held a copy of every book ever written, every treaty, every treaty, every merchant's ledger, every child's drawing on a scrap of papyrus. Others claim it contains secret knowledge, maps of continents swallowed by the sea, formulas for lamps that burned without oil, cures for death itself, even the true name of God, written in a language older than speech. These stories are not lies, they are acts of grief. When something precious is lost, especially something as vast and intangible as a library, the human mind cannot bear the emptiness. So it fills the silence with wonder, with grandeur, with magic. It is easier to imagine a treasure beyond measure than to accept that what was lost was simply human, flawed, incomplete but irreplaceable. The myth becomes a vessel for our sorrow, shaped by the weight of what we miss. Historians argue then, now, and always, about when it was destroyed and by whom. Was it Caesar in 48 BCE, when fire leapt from burning ships to harbor warehouses? Was it the Christians in 391 CE, when the Serapeum fell to zealotry and mob rule? Was it the Muslims in 642 CE, as later legends likely fabricated would claim? The truth is messier, quieter, and far more devastating. The library did not fall in a single night. It faded slowly through neglect, through shifting priorities, through the quiet withdrawal of care. Scrolls were lost to water, to insects, to indifference. Scribes stopped copying. Patrons turned to other concerns. Wars came and went, and in the chaos, no one was left to guard the shelves. But the human mind prefers a single villain, a single blaze, something clean, dramatic, assignable. It gives the loss meaning, even if it's not accurate. To say Caesar burned it is to place blame, to create a story with a beginning and an end. But the real tragedy has no villain only. The slow erosion of attention is the quiet moment when no one was left who cared enough to save it. And yet, in that inaccuracy lies a kind of truth. Whether destroyed in a day or over centuries, the library's disappearance became a warning etched into the conscience of civilization. It reminded the world then, and now, that knowledge is fragile. That even the greatest collections, the most carefully gathered wisdom, can vanish if not tended with daily care. That civilization is not a straight line upward, not an inevitable march of progress, but a flame that must be shielded from wind, fed with fuel, guarded through the night. The library's loss taught humanity that memory is not automatic, that it must be chosen, practiced, passed down. And that every time we fail to copy, to teach, to preserve, we risk another Alexandria. Artists unable to reconstruct its architecture, paint it as they imagine it should have been, marble halls flooded with golden Mediterranean light. Scholars in flowing robes walking in quiet pairs, endless shelves stretching into infinity, ladders leaning against walls that disappear into clouds. None of these images are based on real blueprints. No archaeological plan survives. No contemporary description gives exact dimensions. They capture its spirit. A place where curiosity was sacred, where no question was too small. Where a foreign student could sit beside a local philosopher and read the same text in different tongues and still understand the same truth. These paintings are not history. They are devotion. They are love letters to an idea. Writers set stories there not as historical fiction, but as allegory. Philosophers use it as a metaphor for the human mind. Vast, interconnected, full of forgotten corridors and half-remembered truths. We are all living in the ruins of Alexandria, writes a 20th century poet, and in a way it's true. Every time we lose a language spoken by only a handful of elders, every time a tradition dies with its last practitioner, every time a handwritten letter is tossed in the trash because no one will care, we echo that ancient loss. The library is no longer a building, it is a condition of being, human in a world where memory is always slipping through our fingers. But the myth also inspires. In the 19th century, as empires built grand institutions to house knowledge, they looked to Alexandria not as a cautionary tale, but as a model. The British Library, the Library of Congress, the Bibliothèque Nationale, they were not just archives, but homages. And in 2002, on the very shores of Alexandria, a new library rose. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, its curved roof shaped like a rising sun, its shelves open to all. It is not a replica, how could it be, but a promise, a quiet hope, that if we gather knowledge in one place and share it openly without borders or dogma, we honor what was lost. Not by rebuilding the past, but by recommitting to its dream. And perhaps that's the library's greatest legacy, not the books it held, though they were precious, but the dream it planted in the human heart, the idea that human thought in all its forms, Greek logic, Egyptian hymns, Persian medicine, Indian math, deserves a home, that no voice is too small, too foreign, too strange to be preserved, that understanding the world is not a solitary act of genius, but a collective effort of listening, sharing, and caring. That knowledge is not power to be hoarded, but light to be passed from hand to hand. So even as the facts blur, dates confused, locations disputed, inventories lost, the feeling remains, deep and persistent, a sense of something vast, gentle and irreplaceable slipping through our fingers. We mourn not just the texts, but the conversations they enabled, the Greek reading, the Egyptian, the Persian debating the Indian, all under one roof, not as rivals, but as fellow travelers in the long journey of understanding. We mourn the space where difference was not a threat, but a resource. As the centuries pass, the library becomes less a memory and more a question, one that echoes in every archive, every classroom, every quiet act of preservation. What else have we lost that we don't even know is gone? A cure for a disease we still fight, a poem that could have healed a heart, a tame map to a way of living we've forgotten. And in that question, in the humility it demands, and the care it inspires, its whisper lives on. It's not as a ruin, but as a reminder. Imagine you're holding a book right now, maybe a worn paperback with dog-eared pages and coffee stains on the margins. Maybe a sleek tablet glowing softly in the dark. Maybe a library loan with a due date stamped in red ink and a barcode on the spine. It feels ordinary, familiar, something you might pick up without a second thought. But in your hands right now rests a miracle. It's not the kind that parts seas or moves mountains, but the quieter, more enduring kind. The survival of an idea. Passed through centuries like a whispered secret carried across languages, borders, and oceans. Surviving fires that consumed cities, wars that erased dynasties, and silences so deep they swallowed entire civilizations. This book, this ordinary object, is a descendant of scrolls, once shelved in cedar halls by the Mediterranean. It is a thread in a chain that stretches back to scribes who copied by lamplight, to scholars who debated under olive trees, to a king who believed words were worth more than gold. And in this moment, simply by holding it, reading it, or even thinking about it, you are part of the Library of Alexandria's quiet afterlife, not as a visitor, but as an heir. Every time you open the door of a public library, whether it's a grand marble building in a capital city or a modest room in a rural town with shelves built from repurposed crates, you step into its echo. The scent of paper and dust, the hush that falls like a gentle blanket, the rows of spines waiting to be chosen. These are not just features of a modern institution. They are the living memory of a dream that refused to die. Every time you search a digital archive at 2 a.m., download a free copy of The Republic or on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. Or watch a documentary about ancient medicine, star charts, or lost poetry. Your walking shelves that were once cedar and papyrus. The dream didn't die when the last scroll turned to ash. It migrated. It adapted. It flowed from stone halls to paperbacks, from fragile scrolls to cloud servers, from the harbor of Alexandria to the glow of your screen. The form changed, but the purpose remained. To gather knowledge not for the few, but for the many. Not to hoard, but to share. Not to impress, but to illuminate. Think of the student in Nairobi who reads Euclid's Elements on a second-hand phone. His battery low, but his screen bright, with ancient geometry that still shapes how we build bridges and launch satellites. Think of the grandmother in Oslo who, on a rainy afternoon, opens an online archive of Nordic folktales. Finds a story her own grandmother once told her, teaches it to her wide-eyed granddaughter in a language the child barely speaks, but feels in her bones. Think of the researcher in Buenos Aires who compares Babylonian clay tablets, describing droughts with modern climate data, searching for patterns that might help us survive the next century. None of them have ever set foot in Egypt. None of them speak Greek or Demotic. But all of them are heirs to Alexandriant because they inherited a building. But because they inherited a belief that knowledge belongs to everyone, regardless of birth, wealth, or creed. The library was never about marble or cedar. It was about access, about trust, about the radical, quiet idea that a curious mind, anywhere in the world, deserves a chance to learn. Even the smallest act of sharing matters more than we often realize. When you lend a book to a friend with a note in the margin saying, "This part made me think of you," when you quote a line of poetry in a text message, when you explain the phases of the moon to a child pointing at the sky, when you record an elder's story on your phone so it won't be lost, you are doing exactly what the scribes of Alexandria did. You are carrying light from one mind to another. You don't need a title, a degree, or a royal decree. You don't need permission from gatekeepers or algorithms. You only need two things: curiosity, the quiet itch to understand, and care, the willingness to pass what you've learned to someone else. Not as the true lineage of the library, not in institutions, but in gestures. Not in monuments, but in moments of connection. Of course, new challenges exist, ones the ancients could never have imagined. Digital files, so seemingly permanent, can vanish in an instant with a server crash, a corrupted drive, or a forgotten password. Algorithms, invisible and inscrutable, decide what we see, what we remember, what we believe, a fun prioritizing outrage over understanding, speed over depth. Misinformation spreads faster than truth, wrapped in the same packaging, sounding just as certain. And yet, despite all this, more human knowledge is accessible today than at any point in history. Not perfectly, not equally, not without barriers of language, access, or privilege. But more than Ptolemy could have dreamed when he first imagined a place for all books. The question is no longer can we gather it all. We already have, in fragments, in clouds, in libraries, in memories. The question now is, will we protect it? Will we share it wisely? Will we remember that knowledge is not a weapon, but a gift? Libraries today are more than repositories of books. They are community centers where refugees learn a new language. Internet hubs, where job seekers file applications. Safe spaces where teenagers read in silence without being asked to buy a coffee. Places where anyone rich or poor, young or old, can sit and think without being watched, judged, or sold something. In that spirit, they honor Alexandria's deepest ideal, that thought should be free to breathe. That curiosity should not require a fee. That the human mind, in all its wonder and confusion, deserves a room of its own. These modern sanctuaries may not have colonnades or courtyards with fig trees, but they carry the same quiet promise. You belong here. Your questions matter. And it's not just institutions, it's you. It's the way you pause on a walk to read a historical marker about a forgotten protest or a vanished neighborhood. It's the way you save your abuela's recipe for tamales in a notebook with smudges of masa on the page. It's the way you record your dog's silly habit of chasing shadows in a voice memo labeled, "For future me," or someone who will laugh. These are not grand acts of history, but they are acts of preservations, small, sacred, deeply human. They say, this mattered to me. Maybe it will matter to someone else someday. In a world that moves too fast, these gestures are resistance. They are love letters to the future. We may never know what was truly lost in Alexandria plays by Sophocles that made audiences weep. Maps of rivers that no longer exist, cures for diseases we still fight. Poems that captured the exact shade of twilight over the Nile. The silence where those voices should be is vast. But we do know this. Every time we choose to learn instead of assume, to question instead of obey, to pass something on instead of let it fade, we rebuild a fragment of that library. Not in stone, not in cedar, but in spirit. In the way a teacher explains a concept with patience, in the way a student stays up late to finish a chapter, in the way a parent tells a story at bedtime, not because it's famous, but because it's theirs. The past isn't gone, it's folded into the present, like ink into paper visible only when the light hits it just right. And as long as someone, somewhere, is still reading, still wondering, still caring enough to ask why, or what if, or tell me more, those whispers from the shelves of time will never fall silent. They live in the hum of a server farm, in the rustle of a turning page, in the quiet click of a keyboard at dawn. So, tonight, as you close this story, whether you're lying in bed, editing a video, or simply staring out the window, remember, you are not just a listener, you are a keeper. A link in a chain that stretches back over 2,000 years to riverbanks where scribes first pressed. Read to Papyrus and believed against all odds that their words might matter to someone someday. They wrote in hope, not certainty. They were right. As the world sleeps, somewhere a librarian is reshelving a book, her fingers brushing the spine with the same care a priest might use for a sacred text. Somewhere a student is highlighting a line in a philosophy text, a line that will change how she sees the world, how she lives her life. Somewhere a child, curled up with a parent, asks, "Why is the sky blue?" And in that question begins the oldest, gentlest revolution of all, the refusal to accept the world as it is and the courage to imagine it as it could be. And so, dear listener, our journey through the halls of Alexandria comes to a close knot with a fanfare, not with a final revelation, but with a soft sigh, like the last page of a well-loved book being gently closed. Thank you for staying with me through these quiet hours, for walking with me through sunlit courtyards of marble, through cedar-lined halls where dust motes danced in golden beams, through the soft rustle of papyrus scrolls that no longer exists in the physical world, but still echo in every book we open, every question we ask, every moment we choose to wonder instead of assume. You didn't just listen to a story tonight, you kept a memory alive. For that, I am deeply grateful. Let the story settle now, not as a lesson to be memorized, but as a presence to be felt like the last embers of a fading fire, glowing softly in the hearth long after the flames have gone. If your eyes have grown heavy, if your thoughts have drifted into dreams, if your breathing has slowed to match the rhythm of the sea outside Alexandria's harbor, that's exactly how it should be. Knowledge doesn't always need to be loud to be alive. In fact, its most enduring forms often live in silence, in the space between breaths. In the pause before you turn a page, in the stillness after a question is asked but not yet answered. It lives in the weight of a book in your hands, in the scent of old paper, in the quiet hum of a library on a rainy afternoon. It doesn't demand your attention. It simply waits, patient, generous, ready whenever you are. Now it's your turn to rest, to dream, and to carry these whispers with you not as a burden, but as a companion. The past will always be here, not locked away in museums or buried under ruins, but woven into the fabric of the present, waiting patiently for when you wish to return. And when you do, you'll find it not in grand monuments or dramatic ruins, but in small, sacred acts, in the way you lend a book to a friend with a note in the margin, in the way you truly listen to an elder's story, in the way you pause to read a historical marker on a quiet street, in the way you wonder, even for a moment, about who walked this path before you, what they hoped for, what they lost, what they tried to save. These are the true inheritances of Alexandria, not stone or scroll, but care. If you'd like, join me again another night. There's so many quiet places where knowledge once slept and still dreams. Perhaps we'll wander the candlelit halls of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where scholars translated star charts under vaulted ceilings and debated the nature of zero as if it were a poem. Or we might sit beneath the acacia trees of Timbuktu, where manuscripts on astronomy, law, and poetry were carried across the Sahara in chests lined with goatskin, preserved not by empires, but by families who believed words were worth more than gold. Or maybe we'll follow the footsteps of a monk in Ireland, copying Euclid by lamplight in a stone hut while storms rage over the Atlantic. His hand steady, his faith quiet, his work unsigned, but essential. The world is full of such places, full of keepers, full of whispers. So sleep well, dear listener. Let your mind drift through libraries of memory and possibility. May your rest be filled with quiet pages, some familiar, some forgotten, some yet to be written. May your dreams be gentle, your thoughts kind, and your curiosity never fully satisfied, for it is in that hunger to know that we remain most human. And as you close your eyes, remember this: you are not just a witness to history. You are its keeper, its next chapter, its quiet, continuing flame. Good night.